Right, hello and welcome to episode 0 of what hopefully will be a continuing series that I'm going to call basically Teddy Rambles on Politics. Now, I don't know if that's going to be a final name for this, but very well could be. Now, you may notice I'm actually playing a video game right now. That is true. And I kind of want to explain what it is I'm doing and what it is here I hope to achieve. I have for a very long time been very unwilling to actually start recording a lot of the videos that I said that I would. And the key reason for that is I really don't know what kind of format that I want to get everything set up in. I have a problem where I would like two different things that you can't have at the same time. I would like to have very short, single, little episodes that people can choose exactly what topic, very specific topic, they want to hear, and not really bother about the rest of it. So basically, if you only wanted to know about the history of, let's say, seat distribution in the Canadian Senate, you could focus just on that. That could be the one thing that you're going to look at. That could be the one thing that you want to know about. You don't want to know about anything else, just the seat distribution in the Canadian Senate and the history thereof. So ideally, I would have an episode for that. Now, that would probably be a very short episode, because there's not that much to say on it. Yeah, there's a few interesting things, of course, that's true for every topic, but there's not that much that you can really say on the history of seat distribution in the Canadian Senate. But I would also like an episode that compares the Canadian Senate to all the Senates. I would like an episode that looks at the Senates of all the different countries. I would like an episode that puts everything in the context and see how the parliaments compare and how the political parties compare. And you can't have both. Right now, there isn't really any kind of video service or audio service that has that kind of modular stuff. Like if I'm on YouTube and I want to watch, let's say I'm on someone's channel, a Let's Player who plays video games. And let's say I want to watch a few of his videos, not all of them, just a few. I can go through and click watch later on 20 of these. Any 20, I can just click watch later. And then by going to my watch later list, I can watch all of those videos in the order that I've clicked on them. Like I could even change the order. So I'm going to get into an accident here with my truck. Almost did. I can even change the order of the videos that I want to watch on that watch later list. But I don't think a lot of people do this. I do this. This is how I watch YouTube. But I don't think most people do this. I don't really hear, when I talk about my watch later list, I don't really hear from other people that this is a common thing that they use. So I think I'm pretty rare on that. And I don't want to create a system that's going to depend on you watching YouTube the same way that I do. I don't think that's a good idea. So, if I make these little modular videos, I would need to make a lot of them. And quite simply, in order to get any useful discussion on a topic, I would need people to watch, certain videos. And I don't want to have to tell people at the start of every single video, hey, make sure you watch X, 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 and X. I would like these long videos that really explore the topic so that we can get in depth. But that is just incompatible with these modular, smaller videos. So how would I do that? How would I pull that off? Well, just about 10-15 minutes ago, I think I've come up with the excellent idea. Excuse me. Teddy Rambles. From time to time, I just feel like talking. That's just... I assume other people get the same, but yeah, for me, from time to time, I just feel like talking. I feel like opening my mouth and having sound come out. It's just what I feel sometimes. So, I don't always have someone to talk to. I'm kind of introverted. I don't mind being the center of attention, but when somebody else is the center of attention, and I'm just in the crowd, I always find that a bit weird and a bit awkward and a bit strange. So I actually do better in some ways in situations where I'm the center of attention because it's less awkward. It's much more of a structured environment. Which is how I can and have run for office, despite the fact that I'm introverted, and some people might even say that I'm shy. So there you go, there's the answer to that one. But because of this, I don't have a lot of friends. I don't have a lot of people I can call up and chat with. And the people that I can chat with are not on the same type of level I am politically. There are people who do understand politics very well that I can chat with. But a lot of them have their own ideological bent that isn't... I try to stay away from ideology. And the other people that I can chat with are not always necessarily available. In fact, I've given some of them the link to this, and they might be watching live. Oops. But the point is that sometimes I just feel like talking and there's no one to talk to. And the idea that struck me is I could simply record me saying all this random stuff about these political systems and have that be a longer episode that can help to contextualize and expand upon some of the things in the shorter episodes, so that when I do want to make a longer, in-depth review on a topic, that there is something out there that strings all of these points together, that I don't have to tell you, hey, watch these videos in this order. I could say, hey, just go listen to this, effective podcast. So, this brings me to the topic of today, which is the basic overall comparison in politics of Canada, the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, all of these countries here that are pretty... I'm just resetting the mouse here because it does this sometimes. All of these countries here that are basically what I would consider to be the core of the type of political system that we, people like me, and I assume you as a listener, talk about. And these are the 4 countries that I think will be compared the most, because I believe this is where a lot of the listeners are from. But I will also be looking here and there at some other countries in the they're called OECD, OCED. It's basically a way to define the quote-unquote first world, is that OECD group. Not necessarily just the English-speaking world, but the first world, highly developed, westernized countries that are, basically our allies in most things. So, let's begin at the beginning. And one of the first things that I actually want to address is probably the topic that I have to deal with most often. That is the Electoral College. The Electoral College is unique to the United States. A system that works the way the Electoral College does not exist in any other country. Yes, you will find things called Electoral Colleges in other countries, but they do not work the way they work in the United States. In fact, depending on how you want to compare it, it doesn't even come close. France probably had the more original/famous Electoral College, and what they would do is they would have all their senators, all of their MPs, and I believe even a good fraction of the local municipal elected officials would get together as an electoral college and pick the president. That's how they used to pick the president before the current, I believe it's the 5th Republic right now. So the old, I believe the 4th Republic, that's how they picked the president. I think. Not 100% sure, and again, this is just a Rambles episode, so I'm not going to go look that up right now. But the point is that the United States Electoral College is unique, and I get questions a lot from Americans asking things that are in the context of the Electoral College. Like, for example, they'll ask, they'll see a election results map, and they'll say things like, oh, well, 2011, oh, the NDP won Quebec, let's say. They never won Quebec before, and, oh, maybe if they win Ontario, they could be the government. And it's like, well, kinda, yeah, the seats are important, but the problem with the Electoral College and the way and the context of the questions actually stems from a misunderstanding of the Electoral College. If you ask the, run-of-the-mill Joe on the street what the Electoral College is, how it works, what it does, he will tell you this. He will tell you every state has a certain number of electors. If he knows a bit more, he'll tell you the number is the number of senators plus the number of representatives. And he'll also tell you that if you win the popular vote in the state, even by one vote, that, this gets you the electors. But he will tell you he wins all the electors. Nothing in the Constitution says that if you win the most votes in the states, you win all the electors. This is something each individual state has decided. And the reason they've decided that is that makes that state more powerful. Because you want to be there to get that one extra vote to get all of those juicy electoral college votes. It is not anything to do with the original design of the system. It's more of an oversight that they didn't ban it. Because had they banned it, then it obviously wouldn't be happening. But because they didn't ban it, it became an interest for the states to give all of their electoral votes as a big pot. If you win if you win one vote more than your opponent, you win all these electoral votes. So, that becomes the context in which the Electoral College is discussed. Not just first past the post, worse, a block vote system. Where if you win one vote more than the other guy, you win more than one seat. That's known as a block vote. The block vote is probably the worst, in my opinion, electoral system out there. Block vote is horrible. I despise the block vote. Either way, the Electoral College is unique to the United States. It does not exist anywhere else. And this is something that a lot of Americans get tripped up about when talking about politics. Now, there are Americans who do know this. They know that the Electoral College is a weird thing. And they will then get confused when it comes to popular vote, because they have this presidential mindset where, if you win the popular vote, you win the election. Well, the other big comparison, the big difference between American politics and politics in a lot of parliamentary countries is that and I'll often use this to explain to Americans. Imagine you have no Senate. Now, yes, Britain, Australia, and Canada all have upper houses, and Australia and Canada call them a Senate, but this analogy still helps. Imagine you have no Senate. Imagine you have no president. Now imagine all those fancy powers that the president would have is exercised by the majority leader in the House. Now you are imagining a parliamentary system. And this is something that sometimes I have to explain to people, Americans who don't necessarily know that much about politics outside their own country, is that the number of seats you win is really important. Whereas I think most Americans have no idea how many seats the Democrats or the Republicans currently have in the House. They might have to look that up. I would have to look that up, because I don't know, because it's not important in the American system. It's important to know who has more seats. It's not really important to know by how much. Whereas in a parliamentary system, it's much more common to be aware of these numbers, because these numbers can have much more of a major impact. And this brings us to leadership in general. Now, in the United States, there is a president, and the president is the quote-unquote leader of the country who runs the place. In Canada, in Australia, and in the United Kingdom, there is a prime minister who runs the place. Excuse me. Now, there is a key and crucial difference in how these leaders are chosen, and it may not be what you expect. The key and crucial difference is your day job. What you are expected to do. And that impacts how you're chosen. Because prime ministers sit in the legislature. The president is explicitly banned from sitting in the legislature. That is one of the key differences. That means the president sits in the Oval Office, and when he sits in the Oval Office, you take a look at pictures of the president sitting in the Oval Office. Unless he's taking a publicity shot, where he's surrounded by advisors or some other group, if he's just sitting there, if he's working in the Oval Office, he's sitting behind that desk alone. He is the president. Whereas if you look at a picture of the prime minister working, where is he or she? They're in the House, and they are surrounded by party mates. This is one way people like Donald Trump can get elected to be the nominee of the Republican Party, and why people similarly outside of political parties will not get chosen in a Westminster system like they have in Britain, Canada, and Australia. Because you need not just that one-time party support, not just that one vote of the party members, but you need the support of the caucus. You need the support of the people in your parliamentary party. If you don't have that support, they can throw you out. And they do sometimes. This has happened before, and it will continue to happen in the future. So this becomes a key difference between a prime minister and a president that I think often gets glossed over and ignored, that people don't recognize, they don't necessarily see. And as a key difference, it does impact certain things and the way certain things are done. And this is one of the things that irked me a bit in some of the discussions here in Canada about candidates like Kelly Leitch and other candidates that were perhaps more extreme. Michael Chong even saying that you don't necessarily need to agree with your party to get chosen as its leader. Well, yeah, you kind of do, because that caucus can get rid of you. If the parliamentary party doesn't like you, they can fire you. Now, that might cause other problems, but they still can do that, even in the United Kingdom. Even what we saw with Jeremy Corbyn. If the majority of those Labour MPs had decided to actually say, no, you're not the leader, as opposed to, we don't want you to be the leader, if they said, no, you're not, they could have taken their overwhelming majority within the party and basically founded their own party. They could have said, no, we're the real Labour Party here in the House of Commons. And they could have split the party in two. Membership versus the members. And they obviously didn't do that, because that would be incredibly damaging to the party, but they had the power to do that if they really wanted to. They could have. And in Canada, there are ways that parties can get rid of leaders, and we saw that happen with Thomas Mulcair. The reason that system was invented, the reason that you have these leadership reviews in Canada for leaders of political parties, is because they wanted to get rid of Diefenbaker when he was Prime Minister, and there was no mechanism to do so. In Australia, you need to maintain the support of your parliamentary party. If you don't have that, you're not the leader. You cannot become leader of a party if you're not in the parliamentary party. You can only become that leader once you're actually elected. Somebody else has to do the leadership role for you. To contrast this with Canada, or even in Britain, where if you're not a sitting member, you could still be the quote-unquote leader of the party. The other guy's just the leader in the House of Commons. You're the actual leader of the party. In Australia, it doesn't work that way. In Australia, if you're the leader in Parliament, you're the leader of the party. The other guy might become leader after. Everyone might agree to that, but he's not the leader until he actually gets his seat. He actually sits as the leader of the party within the legislature. So this is the difference with some of the leadership situations in the Westminster system, and that does not work the way it does in the United States. You don't necessarily need that day-to-day support from the party. And one of the key things this causes, one of the most massive differences this causes that I think a lot of people really overlook, is the whipping system. Excuse me. In the United States, in the United States, if you want to vote against your party, to a degree, that's not really a big deal. It happens. If you actually look at some of the votes on the bills that are presented, it is extremely rare for an entire party to have all of its members vote the same way. It will happen from time to time, especially on these really big controversial issues. But for every big bill you hear about in the news, there's probably 50 or 100 you just don't. When you actually go through those and look, almost every single time, there's a few people who vote against the party. It's not necessarily even the same people. Different people vote different ways for different reasons. And going against your party is not seen as this major earth-shattering thing. Whereas in Canada, and the United Kingdom, and in Australia, breaking a whip is an important thing. If an MP for a party breaks a whip, that is something you're liable to hear about on the news, because it doesn't really happen all that often. And part of it is because of that team aspect of the leadership. It's because the Prime Minister is sitting right there in the parliamentary party, in the caucus, and is not the President off in his own office, They're right there. They're right beside you. When you're having Prime Minister's questions in the United Kingdom, you can see Theresa May from all of the Conservative benches. She's sitting right there. When you're in the US Senate, you can't see Donald Trump. So this causes a much, much stronger party cohesion and a much, much stronger whip system. And this is something that a lot of people, Americans in particular, don't necessarily recognize and realize is one of the massive key differences between our systems, is that strength of whipping. And Canada in particular has some very strong whips. A lot of the other countries, Britain probably has a weaker system even than Australia when it comes to whipping. So this causes all sorts of interesting scenarios and situations where you'll have things that will be happening that just don't happen in other countries. Like you won't have these, this bipartisan reaching across the aisle type thing. It doesn't really appeal in the same way in the Westminster parliamentary democracies, because a lot of it is seen as breaking the whip, that you've been elected for the party and you're there, to vote on this set of ideas that the party ran on. You're there to vote for this manifesto, this platform. You're not so much there to vote on your own, issues on various things. Yes, sometimes MPs will break off from the party. Yes, sometimes those people are popular. But a lot of the time, you're just expected to go with the party because the party is what the people actually wanted when they voted for you. Party is what they were considering. So this, again, becomes one of the big divides between the US and the various Westminster systems based on the British system. So that too is something that I believe gets overlooked too often. But we can talk about all these differences between the American system and the non-American systems, but in reality, a lot of these Westminster systems that I'm talking about have their own unique differences. And I want to talk about part of the reason how that came to be. Now, the United Kingdom and the United States are much older than Canada and Australia. That really shouldn't be a surprise to anybody to hear. And when Canada was becoming a country back in 1867, there was some consideration as to what it was going to be, how it was going to be constructed, how it was going to be made. And I like to summarize things by saying that, excuse me, that one of the things that was done was that Canada decided to take what worked in the United States and apply that to the British system. And this is how you ended up with some certain aspects of the government that use, certain phrases and techniques that are used within the other country. Canada has a Senate. Britain, the United Kingdom does not have a Senate. Canada does. And the reason it has a Senate is because the United States has a Senate, and we based a lot of our Senate on their Senate. The Senate in Canada is regional. Each of the regions has an equal number of senators, and again, that is an idea that comes straight from the United States, where each state elects 2 senators. Now, we had also decided that a lot of the ways that the British system worked, we thought were better. So we have a Senate that has sober second thought. It's not just a body that just simply is there supposedly to represent the provinces. It is a body that is there specifically as a check on the Democratic House of Commons. Now, you may think that's right, you may think that's wrong, but it's a historical fact that when the Senate was designed, that was one of its key purposes. That was its intention, was specifically to overrule the House of Commons from time to time on certain issues. So this kind of becomes a comparison point, I guess, between Canada and the United States, where although we have Senates, they're very different things. And literature, we see this acted out where our Senate operates and acts much more like the British House of Lords. The modern UK Lords are appointed for life by the Prime Minister, pretty much, and sit in the upper chamber and pass their judgment on the things that the lower chamber does and stop the things that they feel are too extreme. And that is an excellent way you could describe the Canadian Senate. Our senators are pretty much appointed for life, although yes, they must retire at age 75, but I mean in general that's most of a life. And yes, there is some life expectancy up to 83, I believe, but most of your life, if you're appointed a senator, you're a senator for most of your life. Excuse me. So this is one of the things that was taken from the United States by Canada and yet adopted to be much more British in its way. Now, yeah, I do recognize at the time this was designed, that was not how the British House of Lords worked. But the fact that it does now, I believe, kind of shows the thinking in making it more British. This is something the British did eventually do. They have not adopted an elected House of Lords and may never adopt an elected upper house. And part of the reason is simply this different feeling and thought on how government and politics should be. Now, Australia had a bit of an advantage, because when they were designing their government, Canada had been created some decades prior. So what Australia did pretty much was, instead of looking at the United States and looking at the United Kingdom and just mixing and maxing, is they looked at Canada and they said, okay, so what parts about the Canadian experiment have not actually worked out the way that they were supposed to? And then they said, okay, so these parts here have not worked out. So because they've not worked out, we're not going to do them. We're going to do it our own way. We're going to do our own unique Australian thing with them. And they were thus able to create a system that is similar but different from the way Canada operates. And one of the ways you can see that is that their Senate looks much more similar to the United States Senate, where you have an equal number of senators per state. They also call their states states. They do not call them provinces. They are states in Australia. There is a Senate. There is a House of Representatives. The Australian system in some ways could be seen as much more American in nature. But they stuck with the Westminster system. There is no elected governor ruling over each state. Each state has a premier. And the premier is the person who can command the confidence of the lower house. Even though each state in Australia does have a Senate, like states in America do. That Senate will not be where your leader will come from. Your leader will be the leader in the lower house. That is the premier. That is a Canadian type system and a British type system. So you end up with this mixing and matching of these different ways of operation within these countries that do create some interesting contrasts. Now, I do want to get on to political parties, because the political parties are often what I find myself describing a lot. And the political parties, the differences that we have here is, well, first there's color. I'm a very visual person. I like color-coded tables and charts and all that kind of stuff. And maps, obviously. I love them, but I hope I can say I love the maps that I do. I hope you guys love the maps that I do. That's where I have a lot of fun. Excuse me. So, I do want to say specifically for Americans that the color scheme used in Canada and Australia and the United Kingdom is the international color scheme that is used throughout the first developed world. Now, frequently, when people say this is how the rest of the world does it, Americans will bring up a few countries that don't do it that way. And part of the problem is when they do that, they are almost always countries outside of the first world. They're small, they're poor, they're still developing. And the reason these countries don't do it the way that we do is because these countries are specifically doing it the way they do in the United States. Countries that do their own thing for their own reasons pretty much unanimously do certain things the same way. And a lot of the time, that's not the way the Americans do it. And political party colors tend to be one of these things. Blue is the conservative color. Red is the color for left-wing movements. And in most of these countries, some kind of gold or yellow or orange is the color for centrists. Now, even Canada does it a bit differently in that our red-colored party is our centrist party. Center-left, but centrist. And our orange-yellow colored party is our left-wing party. So even we do things a bit differently. But in Australia and in the United Kingdom, you will see this blue left, right-left divide in the same way. That's the opposite of the way that it's done in the United States. And it is simply something that Americans, if they are aware of, they may not be aware of just how widespread this is elsewhere around the world, where, no, it really is a universally understood standard that red in particular is the color of socialism. That it's understood to be the socialist party when you see the color red, and that blue is the color of the more, conservative party. Even in Canada, where, like I said, the red party, the Liberal Party, is not the left-wing party, you will still understand the context that a red party elsewhere is the Socialist Party. Even in Germany, where the Christian Democrats use black instead of blue, you will still understand that blue is traditionally the color of the more conservative movement, not black. So that is something else I wanted to mention in particular. Now, there are also differences in specifics of policy. And this is something important that a lot of people, when discussing politics, like to gloss over. But it is something that is contextual to the countries and systems you're discussing. Going the wrong way with my truck here. In Canada, if you say that you don't like the single-payer healthcare system, that is seen as a very extreme and radical thing to say on the right. Opposition to single-payer is seen as extremist and right-wing. Whereas in the United States, support for single-payer healthcare is seen as extremist and left-wing. So a position in Canada that is far to the right can be to the left of a position in America that is far to the left on this issue. And a lot of people seem to gloss over things and pretend that politics is all just one issue and say, somebody who doesn't support single payer cannot be left-wing, even if all of the other issues they are left-wing on. And I believe that is simple folly, and that ignores these regional, cultural, geographic differences that you see pop up with specific policies, like gun rights in America. You're not necessarily some kind of wacko, radical right-winger if you support gun rights. In Canada, if you support gun rights, you might be seen as pretty right-wing. In Australia, the same thing. In Britain, you would certainly be seen as much more right-wing if you said you wanted more guns on the street. But in America, that just doesn't work. You're not necessarily some kind of crazy wacko right-winger because you support the Second Amendment. So, there are these certain issues that will make comparisons between parties difficult, but I'm hoping that when I compare these parties, that people will start to see and understand exactly how that all fits together. Now, I will begin with probably the oldest of all of the surviving political parties, major political parties, in the countries I'm talking about, which is the Conservative Party in Britain. Now, they used to be called the Tories. Some people consider the Tories and the Conservatives to be different parties from historical ages, that there was a break. But they're basically, when you look at them in a comparison, they're the same thing. They're pretty much the same party. Yeah, there might have been a period of time where there were both Tories and Conservatives and they were opposed to each other, but it was a very short period of time. So you pretty much have this old party. And the modern Conservative Party is a right-wing party that is, as the name suggests, conservative. And it stands as the model for conservatism in much of the world. That if you want a default example of conservatism, that the British Conservative Party is a good place to go for that. Now, I'm going to compare it to other conservative parties in our 4 example countries. Now, the Republican Party holds more extreme members than the Conservative Party. Doesn't mean the whole party as a whole is more extreme, because there are quite a few moderate Republicans out there. But having a Republican who is extreme isn't seen as wacky as having a British Conservative is extreme. And part of it is simply the existence of other right-wing parties in Britain. If you are on the much more extreme right end, you are much more likely to be, for example, in UKIP. So this takes away some of the radical members that are left in the US Republican Party, and that becomes probably the single largest, most major difference between the two. Now, again, you can say things like single-payer healthcare and gun rights, but again, those are specific to the countries in question. When you take those issues out of the mix, the actual US Republican Party and the British Conservative Party aren't all that far apart. Yes, the US Republican Party probably comes out as a bit more right-wing, but no, in general, they are very comparable to one another. Also comparable is the Canadian Conservative Party. Now, again, it is a bit different. It's probably more moderate than the British Conservative Party. And comparing the Canadian Conservatives and the Republicans will thus give you a much bigger gap, because, again, the Republicans are slightly to the right of the British Conservatives. And when you add up those two gaps, slightly to the left and slightly to the right, you end up with something that's a bit more beyond slightly. You end up with something that is clearly, not overwhelmingly, but there's a gap there, and you can tell there's a gap between the Canadian Conservatives and the US Republican Party. But that gap is not so large and it is not so overwhelming that you can't replicate the size of that gap with the same party in their own country. There are state Republican parties that are as far from the National Republican Party as the National Republican Party is from the Canadian Conservatives. And there are provincial Conservative parties that are as far from the Canadian Conservative Party as the Canadian Conservative Party is from the US Republican Party. Now, interestingly, I want to note in particular that the Canadian Conservatives and British Conservatives are not only part of the IDU, which is basically the International Conservative Party, but the Canadian Conservatives are observers within the European Conservative Party, if you can call it that. So there are quite a bit of contacts between the two parties. Now, in Australia, and this may confuse people from outside of Australia, the more conservative party is called the Liberal Party. And there was a joke recently that this may be what had confused Donald Trump with his phone call with Mr. Turnbull. Someone told him he was a liberal. Now, in America, the word liberal, basically, the understanding of that word, what a liberal is, if you were to ask an American what is a liberal, and they were to list policies, and you were to gather 1,000 responses and write down all those policies, and then take that list to someplace like Europe, and say if someone has these policies, what is he? The European's going to tell you he's a socialist. And this is something that some people don't understand, is when Americans use the word liberal, it always comes with a much more left connotation than elsewhere in the world. And Australia does have this too, but for the right. The Australian word liberal comes with a much more right-wing connotation than you do see in most of these other countries, where liberal doesn't mean that. So the Australian Liberal Party is their conservative party. Yeah, there is a quote-unquote conservative party in Australia, but they don't matter. They don't really matter. Puny little party. But the real party of the conservative movement in Australia is the Liberal Party, and they use blue, as I said. That's the general conservative color. And their party is probably much more in line with the British Party, in that it's not really to the right, to the left, it's a general conservative party. But one of the difficulties and problems that party in particular has is there is a very clear split between the moderate wing and the more extreme wing. And this has caused leadership changes in the past few years, and potentially could cause more in the future. Now, on the left, things are a bit more clear and fit a bit better. whereas Australia has a Labour Party, Labor, by the way. Even though in Australian English the word for Labour has a U, the party does not. And the Australian Labour Party is much more in line with the British Labour Party, especially a few years ago prior to Corbyn becoming the British Labour leader. Interestingly, the Australian Labour Party has a long history. Australia elected Labour prime ministers, within the first few years of becoming a country. One of the first socialist governments in an English-speaking country was in Australia, in Queensland, who elected the Labour Party to a government in the 1800s, which is pretty unheard of when you compare, especially in North America, where we didn't elect, any socialists until 1944. So that's quite a gap there. Now, the British Labour Party is a general left-wing social democratic Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn is known for being on the left of that party and is trying to bring the party to the left. If the current polls can be believed, he may be succeeding, especially in that the party has not collapsed in the way many people thought it would. There was an expectation that Corbyn was too extreme and the party would collapse, but the polling numbers are stable, if not slightly moving up. Now, in Canada, the closest thing to a Labour Party we have is the NDP, or New Democratic Party. And the NDP is not, at this time, one of the two major parties. It has not historically been one of the two major parties. In fact, historically, it has been the third party. And right now, in terms of seats in the House of Commons and polling results across the country, it is the third party. Traditionally, they may get somewhere around maybe 10 to 15% of the seats, maybe even a bit more. But you end up looking at a party that, other than in 2011, isn't really going to take the official opposition, isn't really going to be challenging for the government. Now, in terms of policy, because it's a smaller party, the NDP has actually moved around quite a bit more than some of the other major Labour parties in Australia or in the United Kingdom. The NDP right now is a bit of a moderate party, but they're looking to move back towards the left again. So we'll have to see exactly how that ends up working out. But traditionally, what has happened in Canada is when you have a government, like a provincial government for the NDP, is it tends to moderate itself. And because there have been more provinces that do elect NDP governments, that has tended to moderate the party as a whole. Now, in the United States, there is no real Labour Party, per se. Rather, all of that is wrapped up within the Democrats. And the Democrats include it's a big tent party that includes all range of moderate to even some far left members. But in general, the far left isn't terribly successful in the United States. Excuse me. Now, the Democratic Party in particular has been shrinking in size and scope for the last little while. And a lot of that came with the loss of what's known as Blue Dog Democrats. And the Blue Dogs were especially concentrated in the South. And basically you ended up having somewhat conservative members of the Democratic Party that gave the party a bit of breadth on the issues. And within the past few decades, most of these people have gone to the Republicans. And so the Democratic Party has become, thus by default, more of a focused party on the left, more of a progressive movement. Now, when you're looking for progressive parties, one of the parties that is considered is the Liberal Party of Canada. They're not a socialist party. If you were to ask most Liberals, I think the overwhelming majority would self-identify as capitalist. But I think a large number would also be friendly to social democratic policies. And the Liberal Party is a moderate left party. And they've been that way for a very long time. And pretty much the big debate within the party is exactly how far left you want to go. So are you going to be a much more moderate party, or are you going to be a much more left party? And we've seen a party kind of move back and forth on those issues, and it hasn't really picked, and it's actually settled down in between being centrist and not centrist, and it's one of the reasons it's a bit difficult to classify exactly where it fits in, because it's in a place that most other countries don't have political parties. It does fit quite well with the U.S. Democrats, in that if the Liberal Party had much more members, it would be very similar to the U.S. Democratic Party, obviously without the more extreme left Labour wing. But the Liberal Party in Canada has been widely successful. And for a long period of time, from about the 1940s to just maybe even a decade or two ago, it was the governing party of Canada. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the time between those two dates was spent under a Liberal government. Now, the United Kingdom does have a Liberal Democratic Party, and that did come from a Liberal Party, which did merge with a Social Democratic Party, and that's how they got the name, the Liberal Democrats, was merging the two. But the Liberal Democrats have tended to be much more right-wing compared to the Canadian Liberals. They are much more classically liberal, much more moderate, much more centrist, much more willing to take what some would call a right-wing opinion on some of the issues. Now, the big difference, I would say, is culturally. Although the UK Liberal Democrats might be politically right on some issues, might even be socially right on some issues, culturally they are a left party. This is why they oppose, for example, war. That is a very cultural, political issue on whether you're going to support or oppose war. And culture. Okay, some minor technical difficulties there, but I believe we've got them resolved. Let's leave a moment just in case people need to get caught up or something. So as I was saying, the Liberal Democrats within the United Kingdom are much more of a classical Liberal Party, and they fit quite well with the Liberal parties elsewhere in Europe. So if you're talking of a Liberal Party elsewhere in Europe, you're probably talking about a party that fits with the Liberal Democrats. Now, Australia doesn't have an analogous party. There is no party that plays this particular role in Australia. For a while, there were the Australian Democrats that kind of filled this role, but in general, there really isn't. Now, you might want to say people like Nick Xenophon might fill part of this role, but there really hasn't been, traditionally and historically, a party that fills this role in Australia at any major level for any significant period of time. And that's one of the things that makes Australia a bit different compared to the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, which all have had parties that fill that role at various times. Australia just has not. Australia has always been a bit more polarized when it comes to politics, and part of that stems from the original free trade/protectionism debate that dominated the country for the first decade. Now, there are other smaller parties in all of these countries, and the biggest one is the Greens. The Greens are part of a global movement, the Global Greens. That is an organized political party, the Global Greens. But even the Greens have some pretty major differences. In the United States, they tend to be disorganized, and part of that simply comes down to the different way that the governments are set up and run. In the US, it's a much more localized polity, where what's done on one city council doesn't necessarily have any impact on even the city council next door. Whereas in Britain, you can easily find out the number of councillors each party has. In the United States, good luck trying to figure that out, because they're just not seen as the same thing. They're not seen as comparable. So the US Green Party, because of that, often comes across as a bit of a mess that doesn't really have an ideology, doesn't really have a direction, doesn't really have momentum, especially when contrasted with the Green parties elsewhere, where yeah, they do have some concentration. Now, in Australia, you have a Green Party that I would say traditionally is to the left. And what this does is it means that it's socially, economically, and culturally a left-wing party. It always has been, and it will continue to be. There has been some moderation in some aspects. There has been a bit more of a focus on so-called hardworking middle-class families, which politicians love to pander to. But overall, the Greens haven't really lost touch with their base in Australia, and they remain a green pro-environmental party. In Britain, the party has been debating a shift away from that old traditional left-wing, quote-unquote, radical base, and towards a much more of a moderate stance. Now, right now, the party really hasn't picked a side, although they're definitely leaning more towards the left. But there is a lot of pull within the party to make it a much more moderate party. Now, in Canada, the party traditionally, historically, has been a much more moderate party that might even be described as eco-capitalist. Just within the past few years, there's been some movements to make the party much more of a radical left party, but traditionally within Canada, the party has not been on the radical left. It has been a much more moderate, centrist, eco-capitalist party that is environmentalist, obviously, but also reformist. Excuse me, they want to change the system. So there are also other parties within the countries, but they then become much more difficult to compare to one another. Because you don't have an exact analogy for a lot of these different parties. In Australia, for example, you have parties like One Nation, Katter's Australian Party, the Palmer United Party, that don't really compare with parties elsewhere. Now, we can make a comparison with UKIP and One Nation. And UKIP is the British Party, United Kingdom Independence Party, which fought for Britain leaving Europe. But they're also known for being anti-immigration, and One Nation is very much an anti-immigration party. And both parties have often also been called racist. Now, I don't like randomly calling people, parties, and positions racist. When I hear that, I look into it. I want to know why are they being called racist. And when I have looked into it, I have to say there's a lot more that UKIP can defend itself with than One Nation. One Nation is probably one of the more difficult parties to defend itself against being racist, simply because of some of the things that have been said by members and leaders of One Nation. But the UKIP as a party as a whole, because it has this unifying issue of being against the European Union, does have a lot more that it can defend itself with, because there are simply people in UKIP who only want to leave the United Kingdom, who don't care about racism, don't care about immigration. Whereas One Nation, the one thing that unites One Nation is that anti-immigrant stance. And therefore you do end up with a party that comes off as much more racist. Now, Canada does not have anything like this, but as a political candidate, you could compare that to Kelly Leitch. If Kelly Leitch had a party, it would be very much like One Nation and UKIP. Although I do not actually believe Kelly Leitch is nearly as right-wing as she's letting on. I believe a lot of it is simply to get votes in the campaign. But the political space she occupies is filled by these parties in these other countries. And in the United States, there are quite a few people within that space that would consider themselves to be Tea Party. So you have people who are socially right-wing, who are anti-immigration, who kind of want to cut down on the size of the government. But the one big difference between the Tea Party and these other parties is that nationalist, so-called racist, cultural aspect, where the Tea Party, if given a choice between cutting immigration and cutting the government, the Tea Party would almost certainly decide to cut the government, whereas the other three parties would decide to cut immigration. So that is the big divide between them. Now, these are the big parties and players that you have within these countries. I've discussed the leadership. I've discussed how leadership is elected. And the final thing that there's a few things here related, but one of the things I want to move on to now is the parliament itself, the structure of the elected government, the structure of elected members. Now, in the United States, you have Congress. And Congress, from time to time, will complain... I just got sideswiped on my truck game. Congress, from time to time, will complain about being compared to a parliament. They don't care for that. They don't like that. In reality, yeah, Congress is pretty much a parliament. But there are some, especially historians, who will just viciously argue it is not. So that's also one of the things that makes the U.S. stand out a bit, is that they don't care for being called, that their body is being called a parliament. I don't think there's any other country in the world that minds. There are a few other countries in the world that call their parliament Congress, but if you call it a parliament, they won't really fuss. Whereas in the United States, they will. They will say, no, it's not a parliament, it's a Congress. But either way, Congress has two houses. The first house, the lower house, is the House of Representatives. And there are 435 representatives. And that number was picked basically because that's the number they were at when they realized, hey, we have too many members. We're adding too many members at every redistribution. So let's just stop here. So that's how you ended up with 435. The Senate has 100 members, and that number has changed with history, and the reason it has changed is there are 2 senators per state. Every state has 2 senators, no matter what. California has 2 senators, Wyoming has 2 senators, Virginia has 2 senators, and so on. And this was designed specifically to basically mollify the concerns of the smaller states. Now, it has been suggested before to do this in other places, like the United Kingdom and Canada, and I'm going to explain why that necessarily won't work. But in the United States, this works perfectly and works exactly the way it is supposed to. And because there's very much fewer senators, they tend to be of a bit of a higher caliber, or are at least seen that way. So because of this, debate in the Senate is a lot less acrimonious on average than debate within the House. And the average American could probably name a number of senators, but would struggle to name a number of congressmen and representatives in the House. So that's the basic structure for the U.S. Now the U.S. Elects all of their members through first past the post. So every state is divided up into its proper number of congressional districts, and every state elects 2 at-large statewide senators, and it's all through first past the post. And this brings us to Britain, United Kingdom. Now in the United Kingdom, what you have is, again, 2 houses. You have the House of Commons, and you have the House of Lords. Now, the House of Commons pretty much is what it has been for quite a while, which is elected members, and it's 1 member per constituency. So they are also elected on first past the post. And the United Kingdom House of Commons has 650 members, but that number has changed at various points in history. And an interesting fact is that all 650 members cannot physically fit into the actual House of Commons. The actual House of Commons only has seats, or about 400 and, 427, somewhere around there. So they cannot all fit, which is why sometimes you will see pictures from the British House of Commons where there are a lot of MPs kind of standing around an already crowded house. They just can't fit. The British House of Lords is currently appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister for life. Now, the House of Lords has a lot of members, and it varies frequently. There is no real limit. You can just appoint more if you want. If you decide to, you could appoint less. So there is no real way to compare, but it does tend to be a similar size to the House of Commons. So around 650 members. Maybe 500, maybe 900, around 650 members. So this will end up causing find my words here as I get myself unlost here on this truck game. What this does is it's a reflection more. So it's a reflection of the past. And And what happened in the past is that the monarch in particular, especially in the past, would be the one who would appoint the lords, the peers, as they're called, to the House of Lords. Now, these peers who sit in the House of Lords used to be hereditary. So you would sit, your son would sit, his son would sit, and so on and so forth. But within the past few decades, they decided that was not a good way to run a parliament, and replaced it with a non-hereditary appointment system. There are a few hereditary lords left, and they were chosen by the lords as a whole of people, I guess, who either represent specific titles, or people who they thought should keep like the family thing going. But most of the members of the House of Lords are simply appointed for life. Now, this is not done in nearly as partisan of a way as it is in places like Canada. Traditionally, there is an attempt to keep the party balance in the House of Lords to be at least somewhat similar to the party balance in the House of Commons. Now, of course, you can make exceptions to this, especially when certain parties are very weak within the House of Commons, or within the House of within the House of Commons. But they have, my game is frozen on me, but they have some strength historically, so you would want to make sure that they have a more equitable distribution of seats within the Lords. This has applied quite often to the Liberals, because there have been times where they've had the 6 or 7 seats in the House of Commons, despite at one time forming, majority governments. So this is something you're allowed to do, appoint a few more than you're supposed to, but in general, you're trying to keep things the way they are in the House, keep it looking fair and equal. And in general, this is just a rule of thumb. It's not necessarily something that's even followed per se, but if a Labour Lord passes away or retires, you would replace him with another Labour. So it's not this overly partisan appointments process. And the leader of the various parties will have some input on who gets appointed. And as well-respected members from all parties do tend to be offered seats. Excuse me. Now, the British also have, a monarch, a queen, but she basically acts on the advice of the Prime Minister, and this is how the Governor-General also works in Australia and in Canada. It's on the advice of the Prime Minister, which basically means whatever the Prime Minister says. Now, the reason they're not the same person, the reason you don't have a Prime Minister who is also the King or the Queen, is what's called reserve power. And basically that means if the King or Queen or Governor-General, and for the record, the Governor-General is simply the King or Queen's representative in the country. If Queen Elizabeth was in Canada, and if she really wanted to, obviously she probably doesn't because it's a lot of work for no reason. If she really wanted to, and she was in Canada on the day a senator was getting appointed, she could do the appointment. No reason why she can't. Governor-General is just there to act in her name when she's not around. So, what you end up with is these different people, and the reason you have the different people, as I said, is reserve power, and what that means is if the Prime Minister tries to do something that is utterly insane, the monarch or the monarch's representative can simply say, no, this is crazy, I am not allowing you to do that. And this has happened. It is very, very rare. And by that, I mean there are 2 instances in these 3 countries that I can think of in the last 100 years. It is very, very rare. Now, outside of Britain, I'll go to Canada next. And in Canada, you have a similar system with the monarch, with the Governor-General, who's the Queen's representative in Canada. And in Canada, you have a lower house called the House of Commons. Now, Canada is actually one of 2 countries in the world that have a chamber called the House of Commons, the other, of course, being Britain. And Canada's House of Commons is elected similarly to Britain's. You cut up the country into a number of pieces, in this case 338, and each elects 1 member through first past the post. Representatives in Canada has been continuously going up since Confederation. At the time of Confederation, it was, I think, 181 or 184 members, and now we're pretty much nearing double that. But this has been within, 150 years, so it's been quite a while that it's taken to actually get up to doubling that number. But there have been some concerns that we're getting too many, and something needs to be done. And in fact, an interesting fact for you is that the Canadian House of Commons is physically being rebuilt, and one of the key reasons for that is we literally can't fit all these members in it. We had to completely redesign the benches just to get the current number of members in it. And, you know, as I said, this just keeps going up. So if we can hardly fit the current amount of members, how are we supposed to fit future members? So this is a concern. Now, Canada also has a Senate, and the Senate has 105 members. Now, the seat distribution in the Canadian Senate is baffling to some, but it's actually extremely simple when you actually look at it in a certain way. When Canada was becoming a country back in 1867, they looked at how things were done in the US, and they did like this idea of having an equal number of senators per state. But the problem was Canada's population distribution has always been very different from the United States, and even from Australia. The province of Ontario has always had at least 30% of the national population. And you do not see that, even historically, in the United States. The most populated state was Virginia, which had 15% at the time of being most populated. That is the highest it has ever been. And that is among 13 states. Whereas you have 10 provinces and 3 territories here in Canada, and Ontario at its lowest has been over 30. And this is one of the reasons why the whole equal number of senators per province has not really taken off as popular in Canada. So, Canada came up with a workaround. Instead of saying by province, they'll say by region. And you can just add a few provinces to a single region. That's what they did. So you had the 3 maritime provinces as a region, you had Quebec as a region, you had Ontario as a region, and as it got settled, you had Western Canada became a region in 1950. And they each had 24. Then this, seemed pretty darn fair. Because, back in 1915 when this was decided, even if you added up all of the Atlantic and all of the Western population, if you added all of that up, it still didn't even compare to Quebec, and Quebec was smaller than Ontario. So this was seen as much more than fair. You're giving these guys half the senators, and they have less than a third of the population. Well, as population has grown, this has actually become a bit of an issue. Eventually, Newfoundland joined Canada, and it was added as an Atlantic province, not a maritime province, which means that it does not remove any of the 24 senators that the other 3 hold. It gets 6 of its own. So in Atlantic Canada, you have 30 senators, which is more than Quebec or Ontario or Western Canada. And Western Canada today has more people than Quebec. Western Canada today has a third of the population, but a quarter of the Senate seats. And that does not make Western Canadians very happy, in particular because of the distribution within Western Canada, 6 seats for each province. Whereas Manitoba and Saskatchewan each have about 1 million people, Alberta has about 4, and BC has about 5 million. So BC and Alberta in particular are not very happy with the seat distribution and want something done. Now, one of the reasons why this isn't a huge, massive issue is how senators are picked. They are appointed by the Prime Minister. Again, through, the Governor General will actually officially do the appointing. But the Prime Minister will pick the senators, and they will sit basically for life. This was changed under Pierre Trudeau, and Pierre Trudeau decided rather than just sitting until you die of old age, you will sit until you reach age 75. Now, this became a mandatory retirement age, but it only applied to people appointed after this date. Now, I do believe a few senators have chosen on their own to retire before that date, but up until, I think, 2001 or 2002, you still had a few senators who had been appointed under the old system who were over 75. But they have all since left the Senate, and the Senate right now has a maximum age of 75. Once you reach 75, you are forced to retire. You no longer are a senator. Excuse me. And that is how senators are chosen. Now, up until the most recent Prime Minister, Senate appointments have always been very partisan. The original Senate was created with 72 senators, again, 24 from Ontario, 24 from Quebec, and 24 from the Maritimes. It was originally created to mirror the political representation in the House of Commons. At some point, a Liberal either died or retired or resigned, and the Conservative Prime Minister appointed a Liberal to replace him. I believe this happened again, that 2 Liberals actually got appointed, but if my memory serves me correctly, that was really the last time that stuck, because the Prime Minister and his party simply realized that they could just appoint their own people instead. And from that point, up until, as I said, the most recent Prime Minister, it was always a partisan appointment. If the Prime Minister appointed someone from another party, that was an issue that you would remark on. Oh, he's appointed someone from an opposition party, because it was almost always just from the Prime Minister's party. And because senators serve pretty much for life again, age 75, and because the Prime Minister appoints them, what this does is it introduces a bit of a lag time on Senate control compared to governmental control. And I've actually worked out the math, and it works out to about 7 years usually, that you will need to run a government for 7 years before you could get control of the Senate if the other guys have been in power for a while. And this would impact the Tories quite a bit, because the Conservative Party in Canada throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s did not form governments all that often. So when they would come to government, they would often find a Senate just jam-packed full of Liberals. And there have been a few instances where the Senate has overruled the government, but it's somewhat rare. Now, Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister, has decided that he's going to change this, and has created a body to appoint independent senators. He has not appointed a single Liberal senator, and as far as I know, the body has always elected people who have never been in politics. As well, he decided to remove the Senate caucus from his national caucus. Now, what that means is every Wednesday in Canada, in the House, in Parliament, the party members in the House of Commons and Senate get together, and they're called the caucus. And, for example, the Conservative Party, all of the MPs and all of the senators will gather in a single room for the Conservative caucus meeting. And up until Justin Trudeau became Liberal leader, Liberal MPs and senators would do the same. When he became leader, he decided senators were no longer part of the official Liberal caucus and removed them. So this and what his father did by introducing the retirement age are the 2 biggest parts of Senate reform that have been introduced in Canada in its history, pretty much. Now, when you compare and contrast this to Australia's Senate, you see something much more common to the way they do it in the United States. Every state in Australia has 12 senators, and this number has gone up over time. But right now it's 12 for every state, and every territory has 2. And at every election, half of the Senate is up for election. So that means 6 senators at each half election, and from time to time you will want a complete double dissolution, which pretty much puts all your senators up for election at the same time. And in that case, there are 12, obviously. Now, these people in Australia, they're elected, but not just elected, they're elected through STV, single transferable vote. And the single transferable vote basically means one voter is given a ballot and they mark everybody 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you elect multiple candidates from that. I could explain that, but instead I'll simply say it works. If you really want to know how it works, yeah, I could explain that. I've made some blog posts about that, but it works. That's the important thing to know. Now, in the House in Australia, they also use a different kind of STV. And Australia also has single-member districts all across the country. I believe there are 150 of them. I think there are 150 of them. And they're elected through, again, STV, a single-member STV known as the alternative vote, or AV. And what that means is when you go to vote, you mark again 1, 2, 3, 4, and one person is then returned, somebody who's won a majority of the vote. And that is the big difference in the way things are done in Australia than in any of these other 3 countries I've examined. They do not use SDV. Now, I also want to talk about the differences in living the system. When you go to vote in Australia, you mark 1, 2, 3, 4. And to my knowledge, you do this on a piece of paper. And that is then counted, as far as I know, by hand. And computers are used by the people counting by hand to help them calculate everything. This is, again, my knowledge of how things work. I actually know the least about the way the Australian counting actually works, but to my knowledge, that is exactly how it works. In Britain, you go and you cast your ballot again on a piece of paper, and these are all counted by hand. But when they're counted, they are counted in a central location within the seat. In Australia, they are counted where they are cast. So that means that when voting has ended in Britain, that all the ballot boxes are sealed and they are brought to the central location for the count. In Australia, the ballot boxes are opened at the polling place. In Canada, they are opened at the polling place. And they are counted there. It is a first-past-the-post system. Now, the ballots in Canada, I don't think the design has changed in many, many, many decades. They have looked the same for ages. Provincial election agencies' ballots look similar. And so basically when Canadians go to vote, they know what to expect, because that is how things have been for a very long time. The United States is the odd one out on this, in that every state can decide on exactly how they want to run elections, even elections for non-state offices like president. And some states use electronic voting, some states use punch cards, some states use paper ballots. And the paper ballots, some of them you mark an X, some of them you complete a broken line. It all sorts of systems that are actually used within the United States for how it's done. But it's almost always just a first-past-the-post system. It doesn't really matter what office you're running for, it's almost certainly just going to be a first-past-the-post election result. It's not going to be SDV as they use in Australia. Now, I want to get to some terminology. And terminology tends to be one thing that confuses people, but they actually understand it, they just don't necessarily understand why. There are 4 words that I'm going to explore here that all actually mean the exact same thing, even though the 4 words are used differently by different people in different countries. First one is constituency. This is, as far as I know, the oldest of these words. In Britain, each constituency returns a member to Parliament, an MP. In the United States, they call them districts. If you say constituency, they'll know what you're talking about. If you say constituents, they know what that is. Those are the voters in a district. But it is a district in the United States. In Canada, or let's go with Australia first, because Canada's going to need a little bit of explanation. In Australia, they call them divisions. But again, if you say constituents, people will still know what you're talking about. They'll understand, because constituency is the base word. But they're divisions, and thus you have places called, for example, the division of Batman. And yes, that is a real division in Australia, a real constituency. And finally, in Canada, they're called ridings, at least in English. Now, the reason they're called ridings isn't fully clear, but it seems to be based on the division or the thirding of Yorkshire in Britain. I apologize, I'm probably saying that wrong. But basically, Yorkshire was split into 3 by the Danish, by the Vikings, pretty much. And they were called thirdings or ridings. You have the north, east and west ridings of Yorkshire. And it seems that when the constituencies were being drawn up for Canada, that a lot of the counties got split into 3. And that seems to be the most credible explanation for where that word comes from, is because you would simply name it after the division itself. It's a thirding, it's a riding. So thus you have the riding of this and the riding of that. And when things became more divided, they simply kept the term riding. Now that term is not used in Quebec. Quebec has its own term. I believe it's circumscription, in French, obviously, which basically translates to constituency. And again, constituency is the base word. A constituency a division, a district, and a riding all have constituents. There's no different word for that. They're all constituents. So that's just some of the terminology difference in terms of that. Canada and Britain have a House of Commons. They're the only two countries with a House of Commons. Australia and the United States have a House of Representatives. But they are all the House. If you say the House, people will generally know you're talking about the lower house. Canada, Australia, and the United States have a Senate. Britain has a House of Lords, but these are the upper house. And because of the fame of the US Senate, basically Brits will understand if you accidentally say the British Senate. They may correct you, but they'll understand what you mean. Whereas if you say House of Lords in the United States, they may be very confused. There's also some terminology things that pop up that may not be expected and may lead to some confusion. So, for example, Australia and Canada are both big, empty countries. There's a lot of land in both Australia and Canada that just nobody lives. And these areas have different names. In Australia, a lot of that land is called the outback, whereas there is no similar term in Canada. There is no Canadian outback. There's no word to describe that. And there is also a difference between terms like rural and remote. Rural in Canada is generally understood to mean farming areas. If you're in a rural area, you're probably near a farm somewhere. It's not always a farm. I mean, sometimes it can be a wooded area. But even that wooded area, if you drive for long enough, you'll end up in a farming area. In Canada, if you're far away from that, you're in a remote area. Whereas in Australia, farming area is called the country. And the more remote areas are known as rural. If you're near a farm, you're not rural. You're in the country. And this tends to cause some confusion when talking about, especially representation by population. Because Canada has a rule that says all its ridings must be within a certain range of population. And every province has a rule. And it tends to be that number. It tends to be between 10 and 25%. In Australia, as far as I know, that number is 5%. And the result of this is there are some very large divisions in Australia that are difficult to traverse, that are massive in size, that contain a similar number of people to some of the very small urban divisions. And in Canada, that would be considered abhorrent. And Canada goes out of its way to make sure that the remote areas get that additional representation. Canada, in general, does not give that nearly as much to rural areas. These are the most remote areas that generally really have that notable incongruity, the notable difference in the average population. But when discussing this with Australians, they will say things like the rural areas and the country. And what they tend to refer to is a situation in Australia where there was gerrymandering done that saw a lot of these areas, the farming areas, overrepresented. And that resulted in a string of governments that did not win the popular vote, and that was purposeful. That was done for a reason. So this tends to be a terminology problem more than it is an ideological one, but there is an ideological component to it. Excuse me. And as well, there is the idea of a term. The United States, basically, it's every 4 years on a regular schedule. Whereas in Britain and Canada and Australia, although all three countries now, and when I say now, I mean within the last 20 years, although all three countries now generally have a general set time frame, and Australia's had that for much longer. And part of the reason Australia's had that for much longer is they have a 3-year maximum lifespan of a parliament. And if you're only doing it for 3 years, you generally don't want to cut it short. Now, in the other countries, in Canada and the United States, it's 4 years as the maximum lifespan. Canada used to be 5. And what would happen is if you were leading in the polls, and you were the government, you would decide to have an election 3.5 years into your term. If you were behind in the polls, you would wait till 4.5 years into your term. And in Britain, you saw somewhat of a similar thing going on, although in Britain the official maximum term was closer to 6 years instead of 5. And both Canada and Britain simply changed that by simply reducing the maximum term by a year, which supposedly encourages the parties to stick to a more regular schedule for exactly when these elections are held and not hold them at a time of self-interest. Now, Britain, of course, just had a snap election, and Canada has also had snap elections in that time, as neither one of these laws prevents early elections. They simply supposedly make them less likely. The United States, there is a set schedule, and if you want to know that schedule, you can read the Constitution. It is written into the Constitution when the presidential election is, and if that is to be changed, the Constitution would have to be changed. So you can have a multi-term government in Australia, but again, as I said, Australia has 3-year maximum terms. You could have a 5-term government in Australia, and the term, every 3 years, is a much different connotation than a 5-term government in Britain, where, as I said, they used to have a maximum of, I believe, 6 or possibly even 7 years for how long the House could sit without an election. So that becomes something else that people might not realize when discussing politics with one another from the different countries. There is also a bit of a difference in terms of federal versus non-federal and the powers and elections and the way things are run. In excuse me, in Britain, in the United Kingdom, it's all on the national level. So there is an SNP, a Scottish National Party, but it is a single organisation, the same organisation that runs in Scotland for the Scottish Assembly for Holyrood is the same SNP that runs for seats in Westminster. The exact same party, the exact same organisation, and they are registered with the nationwide Elections Commission. And it's that, excuse me, it's that nationwide Elections Commission that its rules tend to be over and above and outrank rules of any sub-national election commission. In the United States, it's the exact opposite. There is no, so that may surprise you, there is no Democratic Party of the United States. There is no Republican Party of the United States. There are no organizations with that name. And the reason is that they're not parties, they're committees of parties. Both the Democrats and Republicans are an alliance of 50 state parties with those names. There is a Democratic Party of Maine. There is a Republican Party of Maine. There is a Democratic Party of Arizona. There is a Republican Party of Arizona. And those parties, along with their fellow parties of the same name, form the committee that runs the federal, quote-unquote, party. Now, in Australia, it seems to be run in a bit of kind of a hybrid system, where there are state parties and there are federal parties, but there is a notable difference in the way that they're all treated. And you can see that with the LNP in Queensland, where you have a party, LNP of Queensland, that is a party, it's a separate legal official party, but the federal elections, they will treat that as a party, but when you're in Parliament, you will still sit in the Liberal or the National Party room. There is no LNP party room. So that does mark a bit of a difference in the way that's run. Now in Canada, it's much more clear. And the way it's much more clear is there are different levels. There is, for example, a New Democratic Party of Ontario and a New Democratic Party of Canada. These are two separate, legal, distinct entities. They have their own funding, they have their own membership, their own everything. Now, the NDP in Canada has decided to share its membership across the country, except for Quebec, which is unique. So that means if you are a member of one of them, if you are a member of the New Democratic Party of Canada, you're also a member, if you live in Ontario, of the New Democratic Party of Ontario, and vice versa. So they share a membership, but they are two separate, legally distinct organizations. And that is something that you don't have in the United States, you don't have in the United Kingdom, and that does not exist on the same level in Australia. That is one way that Canada is a bit unique, in that there is a difference, sometimes a big difference, between a provincial and a federal party, even if they have the same name. One example of that is the Liberal Party in British Columbia, and the Federal Liberal Party. Federal Liberal Party has tended to be much to the left of the Liberal Party in British Columbia. And in fact, one of the reasons the Liberal Party in British Columbia broke off from the Federal Party is they specifically wanted to be much more on the right, much more of a capitalist party. And over time, it used to all be one party. Over time, all of the Liberal parties have broken off from the Federal Party except for in Atlantic Canada. If you actually look at the Liberal parties in Atlantic Canada, most of them are simply called Association. Liberal Association of Prince Edward Island. And that is because they are still officially part of that federal party. Whereas in the other 6 larger provinces, they have separated off and become their own separate, distinct legal entities. And I believe the most recent that this happened to was Manitoba, which was within the past 10 years that they separated off. 2 years before that was Saskatchewan. I believe Ontario came in the 90s. I believe it was the 90s. Ontario separated off. It was in the 80s that Alberta separated off. It was in the, I think, 70s British Columbia separated off. And early 70s, late 60s is when Quebec was the first Liberal Party to separate their provincial and federal branches. As I said, the NDP also has a separate membership in Quebec, and that's because they have how unique Quebec is, which I will get to before I'm done rambling. Now, you also have the Conservative Party, which has no provincial branches, no provincial relations at all. And this stems from its creation through a merger of 2 parties, one of which did have provincial branches, the other did not, and it was decided that the new Conservative Party was quite simply not going to have any provincial branches at all. But there are certain powers and rights to those who do share memberships. For example, and I don't know exactly how this is written, so I apologize that I can't cite a specific example, but I believe if you are a sitting MP and you are a member of a provincial party, that I think you can get like an advanced seat at a convention, that you can get in without having to go through necessarily all the same hoops as all the other members do. But it's simply a sitting MP. It doesn't say a sitting MP for our party, as most of the other constitutions for the parties do, that would demand you're a member of that actual party. But of course, it's going to be pretty rare if you're a conservative provincial party member for you to be, say for example, New Democratic MP. That just really isn't realistic. It's not going to happen. Now, excuse me. Now, you will end up seeing some, things that will end up happening, obviously, that are just bizarre or weird. But basically, what you end up looking at is that you end up having these parties that, how to phrase? I'm having difficulty trying to find the words that I'm looking for here. It's a bit of a I'm completely at a loss for words here. Well, in the past, historically, let's just start with that. You do have a different evolution, I guess, of these different political parties. And it comes down to the fact that things simply change over time. The United Kingdom has for a very long time had Labour and the Conservatives as the 2 largest parties. The United States has for even longer had the Democrats and Republicans as the 2 largest parties. In Australia, they may have had different names, but pretty much, from within 10 years of federation, you had, Labour versus an anti-Labour coalition or party. Canada is a bit weird in that that's changed from time to time, with different parties playing different roles. So that in itself comes across as a bit unique. But lastly, finally, to basically end the rant for today, I'm going to talk about the specific unique things in each of these countries. And these are things that you may find analogies for within the other countries, but they're all specific and unique to their country. I'm going to start with Australia. In Australia, the one really specific unique thing is the Aborigines. And the Aborigines are a group of people who were there first. That's one way to put it. Before the colonists arrived, these were the people who lived there. But the Aborigines are also different from, say, Canada's Aboriginals, in that, in the natives within the United States, the Indians, I guess if you want to call them that, they're different in that it's treated as much more of a monolithic group. And even within the Aborigine community, they see themselves as Aborigines. Whereas in Canada, you have the various native groups and bands, so you may see yourself as Algonquin or Iroquois or Cree. In Australia, you see yourself as Aborigine. It is a united kind of situation and thing. And that is one of the specific, unique things about Australia that does not exist in any of these other countries. You don't have that. Britain, of course, the native inhabitants are the British. And in the United States and Canada, the native inhabitants are, for lack of a better word, more tribal, because they literally had different tribes, and they never came together as a national force. Whereas in Australia, you did have this Aborigine group that was differentiated from the colonists. So this ends up being a unique situation in Australia. Now, in Britain, the most unique thing is Northern Ireland, which isn't in Britain, it's in the United Kingdom. The official name is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And Great Britain is just Britain with great in front of it. It's an island. It's a big island. It's the island where England is. That's Britain. Great Britain, that's what it is. Northern Ireland is in Northern Ireland. On the island of Ireland, it's not part of Britain, it's in the United Kingdom. But it is so different that it is not considered most of the time. Yeah, the Conservatives and Labour might try running candidates in the constituencies in Northern Ireland, but they don't win, they don't come close to winning. Northern Ireland has its own set of parties that run in nationwide elections, and parties that run in their devolved assembly in Stormont. So, in political terms, it's like a completely different place. It's not impacted by Labour-Conservative debates. It's got its own debates that it worries about, its own issues, its own concerns. And there are so many various things that just don't apply to Northern Ireland. They have different set of laws in many cases, different administration in many cases. A lot of that run by the Stormont local assembly. So Northern Ireland is something that none of these other countries have. Canada doesn't have anything close. Australia doesn't have anything close. The United States doesn't have anything close. Now, in the United States, what you have is a big issue that probably due to culture most of you are aware of. That is African American rights. And this is something, again, that we don't see in the other countries in the same way we see it in the United States. Because there's a lot of historical and cultural connotations, with a lot of various depictions of African Americans by the majority white community that is not very pleasant to think about. And yes, there are racial problems and tensions in almost every country in the world, but the specifics of that African American experience within the United States is very unique to the United States, especially compared to Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. You don't really have that exact same kind of duality of culture that exists. Certainly not in the same way that you do within the United States and the African American community. Now, Canada's big thing that makes it special and different and unique is Quebec. And Quebec is not something that exists in any of these other countries. There's nothing like it at all in the United States or Australia. And even if you try to compare it to Scotland in the United Kingdom, you're still not really going to be fully appreciating the differences of Quebec. It is not comparable to Scotland. It is much more different. And it is, again, something that cannot necessarily be fully understood with how language becomes such a major barrier. If you live in the United States, or the United Kingdom, or Australia, and you have the technology to access this ramble, you can listen to it, as long as you're not hard of hearing. But in terms of language, you can listen to it. The amount of people in Canada and Australia, the amount of people in the United States and Australia and the United Kingdom who don't understand spoken English, as long as you're not disabled, as long as you're not deaf and you're not hard of hearing, people who don't understand spoken English is a very small subset of the population. In Canada, there is a whole province where many people don't speak English. And this becomes a barrier to communication that you don't have even when you have groups of people in these other countries that don't speak English, because of how many people speak English. And the English language itself becomes a political issue because Quebec wants to keep the French language and identity. So, hopefully this has been interesting to at least some of you. Over the course of recording this, I have come to a few conclusions about how I want to do this in the future and what I want to do, and there will be a few changes. But in general, I do think this has sort of worked. Certainly has worked as an episode 0, I guess. Yeah. So I'm going to see how this all turns out at the end of the day. But hopefully we'll be able to carry on from here. So I'm going to finish driving my load of whatever I got to wherever I'm taking it to in this truck game. And all of you can have a good day. And thanks for listening.